We begin with a developing story. ISIS has released a video which is believed to show the execution of American freelance journalist James Foley. The 40-year-old journalist had been missing since November of 2012 when he disappeared in Syria while on assignment. A YouTube video and photos emerged earlier this evening entitled "A Message to America from the Islamic State." The video identified the man as Foley and then showed him getting beheaded. The video also shows another freelance journalist identified as Steven Sotloff. The Islamic State member said that Sotloff would be next if President Obama did not end the airstrikes. The National Security Council has issued a statement on the issue saying, "We have seen a video that purports to be the murder of U.S. citizen James Foley by ISIL. The intelligence community is working as quickly as possible to determine its authenticity. If genuine, we are appalled by the brutal murder of an innocent American journalist, and we express our deepest condolences to his family and friends." We will provide more information when it is available. Our team will continue to monitor this story and bring you updates.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today, the entire world is appalled by the brutal murder of Jim Foley by the terrorist group ISIL. Jim was a journalist, a son, a brother, and a friend. He reported from difficult and dangerous places, bearing witness to the lives of people a world away. He was taken hostage nearly 2 years ago in Syria, and he was courageously reporting at the time on the conflict there. Jim was taken from us in an act of violence that shocks the conscience of the entire world. He was 40 years old, one of 5 siblings, the son of a mom and dad who worked tirelessly for his release. Earlier today, I spoke to the Foleys and told them that we are all heartbroken at their loss and join them in honoring Jim and all that he did. Now, Jim Foley's life stands in stark contrast to his killers. Let's be clear about ISIL. They have rampaged across cities and villages, killing innocent, unarmed civilians in cowardly acts of violence. They abduct women and children and subject them to torture and rape and slavery. They have murdered Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, by the thousands. They target Christians and religious minorities, driving them from their homes, murdering them when they can, for no other reason than they practice a different religion. They declared their ambition to commit genocide against an ancient people. So ISIL speaks for no religion. Their victims are overwhelmingly Muslim, and no faith teaches people to massacre innocents. No just God would stand for what they did yesterday and what they do every single day. ISIL has no ideology of any value to human beings. Their ideology is bankrupt. They may claim out of expediency that they are at war with the United States or the West, but the fact is they terrorize their neighbors and offer them nothing but an endless slavery to their empty vision and the collapse of any definition of civilized behavior. And people like this ultimately fail. They fail because the future is won by those who build and not destroy, and the world is shaped by people like Jim Foley and the overwhelming majority of humanity who are appalled by those who killed him. The United States of America will continue to do what we must do to protect our people. We will be vigilant and we will be relentless. When people harm Americans anywhere, we do what's necessary to see that justice is done, and we act against ISIL, standing alongside others. The people of Iraq, who with our support are taking the fight to ISIL, must continue coming together to expel these terrorists from their communities. The people of Syria, whose story Jim Foley told, do not deserve to live under the shadow of a tyrant or terrorists. They have our support in their pursuit of a future rooted in dignity. From governments and peoples across the Middle East, there has to be a common effort to extract this cancer so that it does not spread. There has to be a clear rejection of these kind of nihilistic ideologies. One thing we can all agree on is that a group like ISIL has no place in the 21st century. Friends and allies around the world, we share a common security and a common set of values that are rooted in the opposite of what we saw yesterday. And we will continue to confront this hateful terrorism and replace it with a sense of hope and civility. That's what Jim Foley stood for. A man who lived his work, who courageously told the stories of his fellow human beings, and who was liked and loved by friends and family. Today, the American people will all say a prayer for those who love Jim. All of us feel the ache of his absence. All of us mourn his loss. We keep in our prayers those other Americans who are separated from their families. We will do everything that we can to protect our people and the timeless values that we stand for. May God bless and keep Jim's memory, and may God bless the United States of America. Good afternoon, everybody. Today, the entire world is appalled by the brutal murder of Jim Foley by the terrorist group ISIL. Jim was a journalist, a son, a brother, and a friend. He reported from difficult and dangerous places, bearing witness to the lives of people a world away. He was taken hostage nearly 2 years ago in Syria, and he was courageously reporting at the time on the conflict there. Jim was taken from us in an act of violence that shocks the conscience of the entire world. He was 40 years old, one of 5 siblings, the son of a mom and dad who worked tirelessly for his release. Earlier today, I spoke to the Foleys and told them that we are all heartbroken at their loss and joined them in honoring Jim and all that he did. Now, Jim Foley's life stands in stark contrast to his killers. Let's be clear about ISIL. They have rampaged across cities and villages, killing innocent, unarmed civilians in cowardly acts of violence. They abduct women and children and subject them to torture and rape and slavery. They have murdered Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, by the thousands. They target Christians and religious minorities, driving them from their homes, murdering them when they can, for no other reason than they practice a different religion. They declare their ambition to commit genocide against an ancient people. So ISIL speaks for no religion. Their victims are overwhelmingly Muslim, and no faith teaches people to massacre innocents. No just God would stand for what they did yesterday and what they do every single day. ISIL has no ideology of any value to human beings. Their ideology is bankrupt. They may claim out of expediency that they are at war with the United States or the West, but the fact is they terrorize their neighbors and offer them nothing but an endless slavery to their empty vision and the collapse of any definition of civilized behavior. And people like this ultimately fail. They fail because the future is won by those who build and not destroy. And the world is shaped by people like Jim Foley and the overwhelming majority of humanity who are appalled by those who killed him. The United States of America will continue to do what we must do to protect our people. We will be vigilant and we will be relentless. When people harm Americans anywhere, we do what's necessary to see that justice is done, and we act against ISIL, standing alongside others. The people of Iraq, who with our support are taking the fight to ISIL, must continue coming together to expel these terrorists from their communities. The people of Syria, whose story Jim Foley told, do not deserve to live under the shadow of a tyrant or terrorists. They have our support in their pursuit of a future rooted in dignity. From governments and peoples across the Middle East, there has to be a common effort to extract this cancer so that it does not spread. There has to be a clear rejection of these kind of nihilistic ideologies. One thing we can all agree on is that a group like ISIL has no place in the 21st century. Friends and allies around the world, we share a common security and a common set of values that are rooted in the opposite of what we saw yesterday. And we will continue to confront this hateful terrorism and replace it with a sense of hope and civility. That's what Jim Foley stood for. A man who lived his work, who courageously told the stories of his fellow human beings, and who was liked and loved by friends and family. Today, the American people will all say a prayer for those who love Jim. All of us feel the ache of his absence. All of us mourn his loss. We keep in our prayers those other Americans who are separated from their families. We will do everything that we can to protect our people and the timeless values that we stand for. May God bless and keep Jim's memory, and may God bless the United States of America.
News from Iraq on two fronts tonight. First this evening, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki agreeing to step down. This is significant, something the White House had said was necessary to try to pull the country together. And second, President Obama is revealing that the immediate humanitarian crisis has been eased. Those thousands of refugees marooned on that mountaintop, some desperately climbing onto helicopters, some of them now able to reach safety. I want to bring in ABC's chief global affairs correspondent Martha Raddatz from Washington. And Martha, you and I were watching today the president. There was something else he said, that aside from the humanitarian mission, there's the other mission that carries on. Let's listen.
We will continue airstrikes to protect our people and facilities in Iraq.
We will continue the airstrikes. No timeline given, Martha.
No timeline. In fact, today there were several strikes by fighter jets and armed drones aimed at ISIS targets. The president making it clear that these types of airstrikes will be carried out with no end in sight. The bottom line, as long as ISIS, these Islamic militant fighters, pose a threat to Iraqi cities such as Erbil, where there are hundreds of Americans, diplomats and military advisors working, the strikes will be ongoing. It's about protecting the Americans there. And very critically tonight, it's about defending these key cities. If Erbil falls, the fear is that ISIS will control the north of Iraq, and their next stop will be an assault on the capital, Baghdad. David.
The ripple effect that could follow. Martha, thank you again tonight.
In Syria today, government warplanes pounded positions in the east of the country near Iraq that are held by fighters from the Islamic State extremist group. A human rights group in Syria says at least 31 militants were killed and 40 wounded. This as American warplanes today intensified their strikes against Islamic State fighters in Iraq. Today's bombings there, like yesterday's, were meant to regain control of the country's biggest dam from the militants. Friendly Kurdish forces reportedly had taken control of parts of the dam by evening. The NewsHour's chief foreign correspondent Margaret Warner and producer Morgan Till are now in northern Iraq, and Margaret joins us now via Skype from the biggest city in the semi-autonomous Kurdish region of Erbil. So, Margaret, we've been reporting this morning or throughout the day that there have been airstrikes near the Mosul Dam to try to help the Kurdish or the Peshmerga recapture that area. What are you hearing on the ground?
Just as we speak, Harry, the BBC is reporting that, in fact, with this combination of heavy U.S. airstrikes, U.S. Special Forces calling in the locations of the strikes, and Peshmerga, not only fighters, but their special forces, they have retaken the dam. That is a critical facility. It controls a big part of the water that flows down the Tigris River. It could ultimately threaten Baghdad if that dam were destroyed, as in fact the ISIS or ISIL fighters did to that dam what they did to another dam earlier, which was to destroy it. So that is a huge strategic, and not just tactical, but I would say strategic victory for the Kurdish, Iraqi, and American forces.
So, Margaret, you were out on the front lines today in the 115-degree heat. What was it like? What did you see?
Well, Harry, we went about an hour south of here to this town of Makmur, which the Kurdish Peshmergas have boasted of taking over with the help of U.S. airstrikes. But only 5% of the people in the town have dared to return, mostly men to look after their property, like one man who'd had all his bakery and electronics shop bombed out. So he said he didn't bring his wife and children. All the men standing around him said the same thing, and that they would not feel safe until they actually, Peshmergas drove ISIS farther south. And so when we went to the front line, in fact, we talked to the commander there, and then he told us, you have to leave now because new strikes are about to begin.
So considering there are so many people displaced, are you seeing the impacts of that in cities like the one you're in?
Oh, absolutely, Ari. I think this is the untold story of this Kurdish region, having been here just 24, 30 hours. And that is that finally the world's attention was captured by the tens of thousands who fled from Sinjar, this Christian community farther west. And then they're making their way into this province, Erbil province, because this is the only place they feel safe. And you've had this dramatic footage. The fact is, since early January, when ISIS first really entered Iraq in force, in Anbar province, Fallujah, Ramadi, and so on, you've had tens and then hundreds of thousands of Iraqis fleeing to the north, fleeing here to the Kurdish region, because it's the only place they feel safe. And we talked to the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and the man who is a senior advisor to the Kurdish Humanitarian Agency, who both said they think it's about 1 to 1.2 million new IDPs, they're called, because they're not refugees, they're within the same country, internally displaced people, just since January.
Crumbling and barely working Russian tanks are what the Kurdish fighters have to rely on. They have little military hardware to stop the ISIS advance, and what they have is old and barely functioning. Brigadier Ahmed shows me their store of ammunition. It's enough to last just 2 hours, he says.
We need outside help, especially UK and US, especially the IS strike, in order to save our families and our nation.
This is a relatively new position. They've been pushed out of the Kurdish town of Jalula, leaving ISIS fighters within 73 miles of Baghdad, and the Iraqi capital would be an enormous prize. There's a lot of tension right now because just a few hours ago a Peshmerga fighter got shot. Just over this hill there are a number of ISIS snipers, and they're picking out the Peshmerga as and when they want to. The Peshmerga wait and wait for the promised help from abroad, but so far no arms or ammunition have shown up. These men are the Kurdish equivalent of Dad's army, volunteers or former Peshmerga who've come out of retirement to help beat back the Islamic fundamentalists.
This I have retired by my money, not for army Kurdistan.
He bought his weapon himself, he says, and the bullets, all 450 of them. Hundreds of miles away in Kazir, in the north of the country, and just 17 miles from the Kurdish capital Erbil, there are more Peshmerga trying to hold the line against ISIS. The lights they can see twinkling about a kilometre away are ISIS lights, fighters waiting to make their next move forward. The ISIS fighters are closing in on Erbil and Baghdad, two key trophies for them.
Terrorism is not an Iraqi problem. That means that at the end they will grow and expand and reach the rest of the world and maybe go and reach the United States itself.
They're trying to hold their positions, but the ISIS fighters are creeping further forward all the time, and the Kurds have little weaponry to take them on. Alex Crawford, Sky News, in Naqshbandi on the Peshmerga front line.
Militia forces in Iraq's Kurdistan are to be armed by the United States in an attempt to prevent it falling fully into the hands of jihadists who are tightening their grip with their self-declared caliphate. Light weaponry and ammunition will be dispatched, but there are questions about what kind of match they'll be against heavily armed Islamic State fighters. Ghana Chichikan reports.
Thousands of Iraqis are helpless in the face of terror from the Islamic State. The jihadi militants are ruthless and well armed.
The jihadist forces in Iraq are probably the strongest jihadist forces in the region and in the world. They are equipped with advanced American weapons, and that's how they were able to ethnic cleanse the minorities, Christian and Yazidi minorities, from many areas in Kurdistan or south of Kurdistan, and now they're attacking Kurdistan.
U.S. officials see no alternative to sending weapons to combat the extremists who now fight with American weapons.
You cannot confront ISIS with flowers.
At the same time, flooding an already deeply divided country with more weapons could backfire in the future.
There is no American military solution to the larger crisis in Iraq. The only lasting solution is for Iraqis to come together and form an inclusive government.
President Obama may want a unified Iraq, but the Kurds have long wanted out. And arming Kurdish militia forces could lead to a permanent breakup of Iraq. Any peaceful cessation of the Kurds from Iraq would be unlikely, considering the region's several disputed and multi-ethnic cities, as well as major oil holdings in both Kurdish and contested territory. Now, as pressing as the Kurds' defense needs are, the question is whether the weapons provided for defense today could be used for offense at a later date. In Washington, I'm Ghana Chichikan, RT.
Well, American weapons have constantly made their way into Iraq during the past 15 years. The United States left behind billions of dollars worth of military gear when it withdrew from Iraq. When Islamist state militants captured major Iraqi cities like Mosul earlier this year, they also seized weapons and equipment which the Iraqi army left behind. The US made tanks, trucks and helicopters, for example. And now Washington's sending the Kurds some light weapons and ammunition. Political activist Riyad Jarrah told us the US is pumping in money to thwart an offensive it created the conditions for in the first place.
On the one hand, we see the US allocating hundreds of millions of dollars to support, fund and train armed opposition groups in Syria. At the same time, the US is supporting the Iraqi central government against the armed opposition groups in Iraq. The confusing part is that the armed groups behind the uprising in Syria and Iraq are linked. You know, an armed opposition fighter in Iraq is considered an enemy of the United States, but once they cross the border to Syria, they're funded and armed by the United States. Definitely foreign interventions and the foreign agendas in the region have opened the doors wide for all of these extremist groups. The Islamic State is a small group with 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers, mostly on pickup trucks. They took out 35% of Iraq's territory in a week.
Well, America's long had an eye on Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdistan in the country's north, which is home to massive oil reserves. But large sections of the Kurdish community also live across the border in Turkey. Supplying weapons to Iraqi Kurds could put the US in a tricky position with Turkey, which has long been engulfed in a violent struggle with its own Kurdish population.
The Kurdish region of Iraq is the one region of Iraq that is more or less firmly under US control. The United States is against the Kurdish movement in Turkey because it doesn't control it. But in Iraq, what's basically existing in northern Kurdistan is a U.S. protectorate, and that's the region, that's where the oil is under U.S. control. Basically, the name of the game from Washington is to keep the oil money flowing in. And ISIS is seizure of the central part of Iraq has basically cut Iraq into three, with the United States directly controlling the north. But if they've used ISIS as leverage against the Maliki government, but they're not about to allow ISIS fighters to invade, to come into northern Iraq that's under direct U.S. control. They want to bomb and force them back towards Syria or places where they're more useful to United States corporate and military interests.
Pictured here in central London, a group of Islamic State supporters appear to be encouraging British Muslims to join jihad. They hope that by handing out these leaflets, others will back their cause. But Iraqi-born Farah Suhail says she was shocked when her and her friends were approached. Islamic State is one of the most dangerous jihadist groups. It controls parts of Iraq and Syria, where it's gained a reputation for brutal rule. It wants to set up a caliphate, a multinational Muslim state in the Middle East. After seeing British men promoting its values in central London, hundreds of people took to social media. On Oxford Street that the leaflets were handed out, this is a copy of one of those. Now in it makes recommendations for Muslim men. Among those are migrating from the UK to the Caliphate and obeying the leader of the Islamic State group. Today the radical cleric Anjem Chowdhury told us that those handing out the leaflets were his former students, but he denies the suggestion they were doing anything illegal.
In lawyer, that there's anything there which is illegal, which the authorities need to be concerned about.
Around 500 Britons are believed to have travelled to Syria to fight against President Assad's forces. Earlier this year, Abdul Wahid Majid from Crawley became the first British suicide bomber to stage an attack in the country. Tonight, the Metropolitan Police has said it's looking into whether those handing out leaflets on Oxford Street have breached terror laws.
More of America's allies are getting involved in Iraq. France says it will now join the U.S. in sending weapons to Kurdish resistance forces in their fight against Islamic State jihadists. Meanwhile, the British Prime Minister has cut short his holiday to deal with the Iraqi crisis. We can now turn to our correspondent in London, Polly Boyko, for more details on this. Well, Polly, do tell us why this rapid European response taking place now.
Well, David Cameron's scheduled to be chairing a meeting of the government's emergency committee, COBRA, right now, and he had been on holiday and he'd come in for some criticism for failing to cut short that holiday and come back to Britain and take charge of the government's response to what's going on in Iraq. But he is under growing pressure to launch military strikes against IS forces. A number of politicians here have been speaking in favour of stepping up Britain's involvement in Iraq, and the media has been talking extensively about the threat posed by IS forces' advance through the country. And the choice of these jets, that can be stepped up very, very quickly. These Tornado jets can either be used as surveillance aircraft, as they are now, or they can be armed with bombs and used to carry out military strikes. So their role can be changed very quickly, and given that France has just announced, as you said, that they will be providing weapons for the Kurds to help fight off that onslaught of IS forces.
Daily now, the British military involvement in Iraq is ramping up. Tornado fighter jets left RAF Marham in Norfolk this afternoon. They're now in Cyprus, awaiting orders. They will be used in a surveillance role, sending back real-time images of the situation on the ground in northern Iraq.
The Tornado will be flying with a highly sophisticated Lightning surveillance pod. It allows us to zoom in. We'll see people, equipment, vehicles on the ground, and that'll gain an understanding of what's going on in northern Iraq, and then we can process that in to improve our understanding of what's going on the ground.
Officially, the line from the British government remains the same. Britain is not about to get involved in bombing Islamic State fighters in Iraq, at least any time soon. But RAF Tornado fighter jets taking surveillance pictures and feeding that intelligence into the US operation so that American fighter jets can bomb Islamic State fighters in Iraq. Well, at the very least, that is Britain associating itself with the combat role.
Back to work for David Cameron and straight into an emergency meeting on Iraq. He cut short his holiday by several hours as the situation heightens.
I'm proud of the fact that British aeroplanes and British aid have been playing a role and will continue to play a role to help these people.
As Mr. Cameron was travelling home, these RAF Tornadoes were touching down in Cyprus. It's thought they'll leave here to fly over northern Iraq.
American jets today hit positions near a key dam in northern Iraq that had been captured recently by Islamic extremists. This, a day after the extremists, members of the Islamic State, are said to have massacred dozens of Yazidis. The extremists reportedly had demanded members of that religious minority convert to Islam. For more about all this, we're joined now via Skype from Duhok in northern Iraq by Liz Sly of The Washington Post. So we've heard about several more airstrikes in the region this morning. What can you tell us?
Well, all we know is that there have been some big explosions around that dam at ISIS positions that we are hearing reports from residents of that. It's not clear at this moment. I don't think whether the US has been involved, but we know they have been involved in a lot of the other airstrikes that are going on around that area, and I think it is expected that these were US strikes. What do we know about the area where the most recent massacre occurred? Well, this is a small village southeast of the town of Sinjar, which is where the assault on the Yazidis a couple of weeks ago triggered this whole Yazidi crisis. It's a very small village. It's in a remote area. Reports from there have been rather sketchy, but what we know is that at about 1 o'clock yesterday, fighters with the Islamic State did go into that village and they apparently killed, we have a number of 84 men. They lined them up and executed them, and they took away around 300 women. Is there any connection between the timing of when President Obama said that the humanitarian operations on the mountain are done?
The situation on the mountain has greatly improved.
And when these people went in for the massacre?
Well, yes, that's what a lot of Yazidis and some Kurds are telling us. They believe there is a direct connection between President Obama calling off the humanitarian airlift of Yazidis, which had been planned in the mountain nearby, and the Islamic State fighters going in and killing these people. They had been surrounding these people for a week, demanding that they convert or risk death. So it could be that they were planning to go in anyway, but a lot of people feel that was a sense that they were off the hook, a green light, if you like, from President Obama to continue killing in the area.
And have they made more advances in the region since the humanitarian crisis has really occupied most of our headlines here in the West?
Well, they've been continuing to advance throughout this time. They've never really stopped. The airstrikes did halt them on the outskirts of Erbil, but they have continued to make gains in the far southeastern corner of Kurdistan, down near the Iranian border. A place called Jawlaula fell last weekend, and they've been making a lot of gains recently in the northern Aleppo countryside in Syria, the furthest other edge of the area they control. They've been taking a lot of small towns and villages around Aleppo just in the past few days, and people are very afraid that the Syrian rebels there are going to lose control of the border with Turkey and perhaps the town of Aleppo itself.
And what about the talk that perhaps U.S. military aid could come to Kurdistan, or other European countries could assist in this fight?
Well, it's my understanding that U.S. military aid has already arrived in Kurdistan. It was announced earlier this week that the U.S. was prepared to send the aid directly to Kurdistan. They are coordinating this with Baghdad. They're not bypassing the federal government in Baghdad. They're not cutting a separate deal with Kurdistan, if you like, but they are sending arms. And it's my understanding that some have already arrived.
Liz Sly of The Washington Post joining us via Skype from Iraq.